everyone. Welcome to Hauser Wirth. My name is Amanda Stoffel. I'm a partner with the gallery. We are thrilled, where are you, to have the brilliant Christina Kimeze here to celebrate the opening of her first solo exhibition with the gallery and debut show in the US. I'm going to be a little cheesy for a second. I think we should just take a collective moment and look around us. We are so grateful to Christina for bringing such luscious beauty into the world at this moment. These stunning new paintings are distinctively rich in color and texture. Christina creates them using dry chalk and oil, pastels on suede matboard, a combination that gives her work a unique tactile quality. I was so moved the minute I saw these paintings in this space, in this light, in Los Angeles, and I cannot tell you how grateful we are to have the opportunity to have these here. This new exhibition explores what Christina calls the in-between spaces, where boundaries between interior life and shared experiences blur and evolve. Christina received a postgraduate degree from the Royal Drawing School and was awarded the Sir Denis Mahon Award in 2022. And prior to this, Christina completed an undergraduate degree in biological sciences from the University of Oxford. Her first UK solo exhibition, Between Wood and Wheel, also absolutely extraordinary, was on view at South London Gallery earlier this year. Tonight, we are honored to have visionary arts leader and very dear friend of the gallery, Sandra Jackson-Dumont, guide us in conversation with Christina. As a curator, educator, and cultural producer, Sandra has been invested in transforming cultural spaces into vibrant hubs of creativity and connection. Passionate about bridging academia, popular culture, and diverse communities, she engages archives, artists, and audiences in dynamic exchanges that redefine art's role in society. Former director and CEO of the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, Sandra's career spans esteemed institutions where she has held leadership roles including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Seattle Art Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem. We have Thelma here tonight with us as well. Welcome, Thelma. And the Whitney Museum of American Art. Please join me in welcoming Christina and Sandra.
Thank you. First of all, we're going to ask all of you, the videographer is going to kill us, but you got to come up closer. So please step in, come very, 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 very close. What a treat. Instead of sitting in some chairs, we're going to walk through this gallery together. If you can't hear us, just like look at me deeply and say, can't hear you. But it is an honor to be here with you today on the occasion of your very first big gallery show.
Yeah.
And it is exciting to hear you talk. We were speaking earlier and she was sharing her perspectives on her work. And so there are a couple of ideas that seem to surface and I'm gonna just prompt her to talk about them. I really don't have to be here because this amazing woman is incredible. So can you talk a little bit about this idea of your work addressing ideas of the in-between, the interstitial?
Yeah. Well, I'm first of all, I want to say I'm so happy to be here. So thanks for coming, everybody. And I think the idea of the in-between really kind of charts my interest in the in-between charts my kind of journey to becoming an artist. Being fascinated with trying to render something of the human condition and the complexities therein. And, that we can't just fit a lot of those ideas into neat boxes, that it's complicated and it maybe sits on the boundary of two things. And so my way of trying to make sense of that is often to try and find a visual motif to somehow find a route through those ideas. So whether that's a spiral staircase, mapping or following providing a route through a space, or maybe more dynamic ideas of roller skating and that's.
So these works here, all along this wall, are works related to this idea of roller skating as a metaphor for freedom. How many of you been roller skating before? I mean, I know that everyone has not been roller skating. But I do have to say, to be black in roller skate is like a unique thing. There is music, there's like, there are these like dances that show up. And can you talk about this idea of roller skating as an act of freedom that you often reference in your work?
I mean,
And maybe even share with us.
Yeah, so I mean, this painting is called Those 8 Wheels, and it's a direct, that title is a direct quote from a poem called Night at the Roller Palace by January Gill O'Neill. And when I did my show at the South London Gallery, I was looking at this idea a lot of using roller skating as a metaphor, I guess, a sort of more dynamic metaphor for navigating some of these complex spaces and emotional landscapes, really. And, roller skating, I guess I was really interested in spaces where, we're all sharing in something, because a lot of my work before the sort of skating, which then became the kind of soaring flight paintings, was looking at figures on their own in moments of introspection. And the whole idea with the skating was to kind of look at spaces of communion and look at spaces of community, and where, we can all be sort of doing the same thing, but actually having a very different experience. With the South London Gallery, that, I don't know, the director of the South London Gallery actually is here, Margot Heller, but that's the paintings that I made for that space. That space has always sort of reminded me of a roller rink. And so I made a series of paintings, which these paintings then lead on from. And so kind of fleshing out those ideas of, when I was speaking to a lot of skaters, the recurring theme that kept coming up was that, people feel like they're flying, and there is this intense feeling of freedom and soaring. And that's something that I wanted to capture. I guess a lot of the time I'm thinking about how something, trying to visually represent how something kind of feels in the mind's eye, as opposed to trying to, very kind of truthfully render it, I guess. So like bringing in other elements which are important to me, and maybe more personal motifs, which can, it's that moment when you sort of realize that the personal is simply enough, because sometimes, that's relatable and it becomes universal. So the paintings along this wall, I would say, are the sort of skating paintings. And I often use poetry as a way into the work. So, a lot of these paintings will take their titles from poetry. This painting is part of a series which follows on from Those 8 Wheels. And this maybe if we stop at this one, actually, this is...
Want to talk more about this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this painting actually takes on, this is the title painting for the show. This is called Long Loops. This is actually, the title comes from a Tom Gunn poem, which talks about fluidity and has this sense of an otter moving through water and drawing parallels with a skater. And I just love the sort of open-endedness of that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this idea of freedom, we were talking earlier, and this idea of like floating or flying and skating, when you're moving, you feel like you're flying in many ways. We were talking about it as also being kind of, I said it reminds me of Faith Ringgold and how she has that series where she's flying over Harlem. And I said, but there's something spiritual about it. And sometimes when people are thinking about freedom, there's like this notion of fleeing something. But you were talking about freedom as joy and not necessarily being related to fleeing, but...
Right. Yeah, I think that's definitely something I wanted to capture in these paintings, and also like leaving it open-ended enough that people can project themselves onto it too. Yeah, I think, those notions of freedom are contained in the work, not just in the subject, but also like the way that I make the paintings. That's important to me, that, these are quite experimental works, and they always have been. The surface that I work on is called suede matboard. It's like a cousin of velvet. It's a napped surface. It's got a pile to it. And I found that surface like quite intuitively. I mean, I guess like for context, I went to art school a bit later than, the other people on the course. I was 10 years older than everybody. Like I was coming into this having had a career, having had this detour. And, when I finally had the opportunity to study, and it was like a very practical course, there was no theory. It was just making all day, every day. And I just couldn't believe my luck. I loved that. I relished the making. And I think that experimentation sort of intuitively led me to this surface. I started stretching velvet initially and working on velvet. And I think those sort of haptic qualities of the surface, when talking about ideas to do with emotions and freedom and the female body, often feels important, the sense of touch, the sense of softness, because I make these works with I use my hands. I often don't use a brush. They're very felt works,
Talk a little bit more about materials.
Yeah.
So you talked about the surface, the suede board and velvet.
I mean, the suede board is, like I said, it's this sort of cousin of velvet. And I guess, I started off. So these larger paintings are built up with like panels. So you can see these sort of individual panels. And, I started off with a really small studio, and I could only really work on one panel. And then the paintings grew as my studio grew. And, I also tend to work at home because I've got 2 young kids. And so, I work when they've gone to bed at the kitchen table. So, like, I think that thing of your your situation dictating the mediums that you can use and the size of the work that you can use is very present in my work. And, I just, the sort of, I was saying to Sandra earlier that, I went and I did a talk at my daughter's school about my art the other day, about my work. And
how old are your kids?
6 and 1.
So she did a talk at her daughter's school. 6 and 1. 6 years old and 1 year old, which is not uncommon for artists to do, to go to their kids' schools. They're like any other parents.
Yeah.
But we were talking about like language, like using language that's much more generous, and not necessarily language that's ostracizing. And sometimes the art world can be that way.
Yeah.
And so maybe talk about your...
I mean, I think because I came to it a little bit later, I was very conscious of being excluded from a lot of artistic spaces. Not that people were actively trying to exclude me, but just because I wasn't in it, I wasn't. And when I went to art school, I suddenly was in this situation. I was suddenly, I did a postgrad, so most the other artists on the course had been following more conventional routes to arrive at that spot. But they were great at talking about their work, and they were, using it, because it's a new language, isn't it, talking about your work. And they were, and that's great, but I suppose because I had that intense awareness, I suppose, of how that feels to be on each side, it's important to me that there is, that there's a generosity, I suppose, in the work, but also in how I'm trying to describe the ideas. And also, some of the motifs in these works directly referencing the way that the works have been made, and like making that clear. You'll notice in some of the paintings that we'll get to, but like there's like some recurring motifs of circles, and I'm often painting around, paint pots to get those shapes in the work, and that feels important to your point, of sort of showing how something is made. And engaging with that, those kind of, I suppose, more like childlike ways of why we, why I first started making work in the first place. It's about the sort of the dirty side of making, the getting your hands dirty. Like, how is this? How is this made? Yeah.
Yeah. So why don't we move over to one of these works, and you can actually walk us through one of these paintings.
Sure.
With that? Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I guess this is to what we were talking about, like trying to like flesh out something of the complexity of, you know, the human condition and these kind of emotional landscapes. The way that I try and make sense of that is I'm often looking for these anchors or metaphors to sort of make sense of it. And the spiral staircase is you know, is a motif that I've used, you know, a fair bit. And also is kind of referencing other painters that have used, you know, that have used that motif and have thought about spirals, like Louise Bourgeois, who talked, you know, a lot about, you know, spirals and the directionality of whether you're moving, you know, out of the spiral and you kind of got your shit together. If you're moving in, then things are going a little bit out of control. And so these works were really a response to some of those ideas. Mm-hmm. You know, these are they're individual works, but I called them Bloom How You Must, 1 and 2, which are both taken from Lucille Clifton poems, which I thought had that perfect sense of kind of, I guess, sort of acknowledging different bits of the self, perhaps, you know, almost like a call to action.
Yeah. We were also talking earlier about music, film, poetry being serious references or serious inspirations for you. And it came up because I was talking about the tension between figuration and abstraction in the work, or not even tension, but like a relationship that feels really rich, almost like improvisation in many ways. And then you were like, oh, my work is all about experimentation. And so maybe you can talk a little bit.
Yeah, and it was interesting when you said that, because I often think about, you know, like making work in relation to music. And when you think of musicians who are improvising, you know, and there's something of that in how I like to work, that there's, you know, I start with the initial idea or concept, and then there is this process of kind of freestyling, I guess, to use the music kind of terminology, but sort of freestyling, and then pause, and then you take something, you know, so you kind of assess what's worked, what hasn't worked, and it takes you in exciting directions, you know, like, because well, in my opinion, it's a more exciting starting point, because, you know, it always throws up something that you just wouldn't expect, you know? And I think that's really important in the work, having that element of improvisation or chance, which then takes the work in another direction. I mean, with these two works, I knew that I wanted to have the staircase motif as like a central point, but, you know, in other aspects of the work, I sort of allowed it to be led by chance, I guess. Yeah. And I think that the materials feed into that as well. And maybe that is also going back to like my time as a scientist and wanting to have that degree of experimentation, you know, with materials and surface, and seeing how the materials interact with each other on the surface, you know, is always really exciting with the suede matboard, because they behave in really interesting ways and quite unexpected ways, and you end up with this almost like in-between sense of, you know,
Yeah. We also talked a little bit about the colonialism and the impact of the...
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, like, you know, there are direct references to colonialism and the legacies and kind of atrocities therein, like, within the work. But I also think it's really important that within my work, and I'm not talking about these works necessarily specifically, but within my work more generally, to sort of move past that and them to represent sort of imagined landscapes free from some of those legacies, you know? I mean, the sort of the recurring motifs of the foliage is a direct reference to the matoki leaves, which is specifically endemic to Uganda, which is where my family are from. And, you know, within the creation myth of Uganda, kin to plants, matoki plants. And, you know, fast forward to, you know, when the British came to Uganda and sort of tried to spread the gospel as a precursor to colonialism, they kind of used the Baganda people, who are my family, as kind of agents of imperialism. And everywhere the Baganda people went, they planted these matoki trees. So it sort of formed like a map, I guess, through the country. And so in that sense, like, you know, some of these kind of motifs in my work are sort of, yeah, directly referencing these legacies, but I want there to be joy, and I want there to be, you know, yeah, imagined landscapes as well, where we can, you know, move past that, I suppose. Yeah.
We're going to go around. Let's go around the corner here. So this work, which is smaller than all the other works in the gallery outside of the ones around the corner, really is one quite beautiful, but two, we could have talked about these works at the same time, because you were talking about like this reoccurring theme of the circle.
Yeah.
So maybe you can chat about that and how that, if you walk through all the works.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of speaking to, you know, I mean, so there's the circle motif going on, you know, in this painting, and there's also sort of arches. I don't know if you notice in the painting, this is part of a series of paintings that I did, which references like a partition or a screen that I have in my studio, which I paint from. And it's like a folding screen, and it's got these arches. And so they've appeared quite a lot in my work, and this idea of screens and curtains and you know, the different parts of ourselves that we choose to kind of put forward in certain situations, and what we choose to sort of keep for ourselves. So, like, very broadly, it's reoccurred as a motif in the work, and I think you know, this painting is called Carnival, and I guess, like the skating paintings, I you know, where I was bringing in ideas of reverie and, you know, the idea of a shared experience. You know, that felt important in this work. I mean, some of these circles are, in fact, all of these circles are me painting around, you know, different paint pots, or, you know, yeah, pots of paint, pots of pigment in my studio. And, you know, referencing how the painting is made and the making. But also sometimes, you know, I'm trying to introduce more formal elements into the work. You know, as a way of building up the image, because my mark making tends to be quite varied and often quite loose. So, you know, on a formal level, sometimes, you know, introducing these motifs can do that, and yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is really beautiful about how you talk about your work is through the lens of generosity, that you want to, one, be generous to yourself as a maker, two, be generous with materials and intentional, but also be generous with the public, and creating these opportunities for people to have their own projections on the work, and not dictate how they see things. The way that you talk about film being a point of entry for you, and it being open, and music, they provide these kind of pathways. So in saying that, I'm going to do the thing you maybe don't want me to do, but I'm going to ask for someone if they have a question. Sure. I saw, where's Thelma? She's going to kill me. Oh, you have a question. Okay, great.
Can you talk about your use of color?
Yes.
Is it something that you just have an intuitive feeling for, or do you set kind of a plan and say, I'd like to work in the warm or the cool factors, or in contrast to both?
I think I definitely don't plan it out. in terms of my use of color. I mean, I often will plan to, I use a lot of purple, actually, and a lot of yellow. They're sort of my go-tos. Like if I'm a bit stuck in the studio, I'll mix a yellow or a purple. And I think, maybe that in part stems from like dealing with ideas of emotion and interiors and wanting to ground that in sovereign colors like purple, which speak to, sovereign spaces and these kind of protected spaces. And so from that, I think that with purple, definitely that reoccurs. But I think often, like with color, it's quite intuitive, and the surface also changes it. It changes when you start to layer color, depending on what the texture that you're putting, that you're layering the color in, and color is relational. It changes depending on what it's sitting on top of or what it's sitting next to. So I think, there's definitely often like a heat in the work, which I think is like referencing, I guess the heat of Uganda and some of these more kind of personal links.
There's so much, there's also these earthy kind of undertones too that are really warm. Yes, sir.
Paintings, I said they were all in your studio.
Yeah.
And then eventually it ends up in a big room here, and we know with all these people staring at you, listening to every word.
Yeah.
Is that a bit of a shock?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, these paintings have traveled from my studio, which is in like the depths of East London with no running water, no heating. In the winter, I wear like 3 coats and I put a hot water bottle down my top as well. And, and often I'm trying to paint heat, So there's that. But yeah, it's and also because I work in these sections, they're panels, I staple them to the wall in my studio. And so there is this element of like, when they leave my studio, they're in sections, and then I see them again here, and they've been put back together. And so yeah, absolutely, it's a transformation. Yeah, it is a shock. Yeah.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yes?
Hi.
Hi.
What prompted you to move from science and to go to art school? What was there a specific thing
That's a
that
good
happened?
question.
Or what initiated that?
So from studying science, I was always making work. I was always, that is like the thing that I always did. I don't know, none of my family are artists or creatives. It's just something that I always had. So when I was when I was studying biology, I would sometimes bunk lectures and go and draw. I just always had this kind of commitment. I honestly do not know where it came from, but I think I'd always wanted to sort of take that time to build a practice. And it was after having quite a few detours, working in lots of different jobs, working with my sister, that I then had a baby, my first baby. And then I just, these major life events make you kind of refocus. And I applied to art school. And what was amazing about the drawing school was that it was a scholarship. So I was able to, just focus on making, and I was given a studio space, and it just was transformative, really. Yeah.
I mean, the science, I think, shows up in many ways when I hear you talk about your practice, like this whole notion of experimentation, but also very speculative. It's like, what would happen if I use this material? What happens to the surface? Even when you were describing it earlier, it was like, there's this sheen that comes out because of the two materials interacting. And but the way you were describing it, it was as if it was a science experiment that you were pursuing versus, just paint,
Yeah. And I think that definitely comes out in the work, for sure. That kind of, it's easy for me to see that now, when you look back at the work, but absolutely, yeah. There's that experimentation and wanting things to kind of teeter on the edge of failure is important, I think, for me. Yeah.
That's one for the moment. Keep you on the edge of failure. Okay, we have one more question, I think. Yes.
You spoke earlier about the references that you make to music,
Yeah.
to other forms of art. You also spoke to the amount of experimentation that's in your work. And I was wondering, within your practice and within your process specifically, is there a level of active input in that process? Are you listening to music and does that draw out a kinetic
absolutely.
response?
Yeah, I mean, and actually a big part of my practice, which, isn't in this show, but it's actually, working at home when the kids are gone to bed at the kitchen table and painting from film a lot of the time. And it's then, painting from, usually on paper, sometimes on aluminium if I'm doing them in the studio, but something that's very different to the suede, because the suede is a very specific surface to work on. So I like to have that as a counterpoint. And then with those more direct references, I will work from them as well as drawings from life. But I don't tend to work from photographs, or, I will work from other drawings or paintings because I need that space. The space it gives you when something's slightly more open-ended than a printout or something. Yeah.
I think we should wrap up. She didn't want to. She was happy to take questions, and but I think we should wrap up. It is an honor to be here and witness your first show, this first big show, and thank you for sharing this work. It's sensitive, it's generous, it's giving and beautiful, and it is. It feels very human and humane in ways that I think we need this right now. And I think one of the things that's really powerful also is the way you're talking about the work as being also communal. In this moment where so much of our lives is focused on being divided, it's beautiful to see work that calls you to be personally engaged in communal activities that feel also interstitial. They're more complex than just being in quiet. And so thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.